Hi, my name is Elke Vanwildemeersch. I'm a policy officer of the Environmental Education Program of the Ministry of Environment and Spatial Development of the region of Flanders in Belgium. Belgium is situated between the Netherlands, Germany, Luxembourg and France, and on the other side of the North Sea, of course, the United Kingdom. We are a rather complex country. We have, in addition to a national government, 5 governments according to language communities and regions. So I work for the regional government of Flanders. For environmental education, we work at 4 different locations, Brussels, and 3 educational centers, which you can see on the photos, each with its own specific context. Within the sector of environmental education in Flanders, the Flemish government plays a specific role, namely that of facilitator, connector and knowledge partner. On the right, you can see our different target groups, teachers and school leaders, lecturers and others involved with teaching and learning in higher education, environmental education practitioners, and our educational centers reach a broader audience. On the left, you can see a number of more general objectives linked to follow-up and dissemination of research, international and national ESD policy, and organization of networking, as well as the organization of in-depth thematic innovation trajectories on topics like spatial development, nature, food, and climate change. Given the time, we would be able to talk for up to 1 hour about every single line on this scheme, but we'll focus on the theme of this seminar, namely climate and locally relevant teaching. Climate is, of course, an important focus in our work. It is one of the most important challenges of the moment, and young people have also made it very clear last year. So I will highlight where climate change is embedded in our work, starting at the left side. In networking and policy, we are working with the University of Ghent in Belgium on a European research project on locally relevant education, piloting the method in some schools together with MOS, a kind of eco-schools program for compulsory education. The Flemish government has set up a task force on climate and education. The climate guide below and the projects on higher education are a result from this forum, but more on this later. On the right side, how climate is embedded in MOS, our eco-schools program. You will hear all about it in session 3. For higher education, I'll talk briefly in this presentation about research on climate education practices and living labs. And climate change is, of course, a very important topic in the context of learning to deal with very complex sustainability challenges as a teacher in the teacher training. I will dig into our program for teacher training further on. And of course, our educational centers have developed numerous educational resources, exhibitions, debate cafes on climate for various target groups, but unfortunately, I'll have to skip that part. This leads us to the first part of the presentation, how the Paris Climate Conference in 2015 led to a cooperation between the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Environment, starting in 2016. If we go back to our scheme, most of the projects are in the green blocks of the overview of our program, namely to the left, networking and partnerships with the Ministry of Education, and climate change is one of our thematic innovation trajectories, and we've got on the right side some very concrete projects for compulsory and higher education linked to this partnership. 2 climate conferences were held in 2016 in Flanders after the Paris Climate Conference. One to launch a broader process with roundtables per sector, and another to finalize and ratify the results on a political level. There were roundtables per sector and one on education as well, where the goals and plans were designed and negotiated. A budget of 54 million euros was earmarked for the concrete implementation of the plans for the education sector. The majority of this budget went to infrastructural adaptations in the context of climate change, but a part also went to climate education. The concrete projects that followed from this were paid for with a budget from the Ministry of Education, but were set up and implemented with support from the Ministry of Environment. For higher education, 2 projects were implemented, each with a specific call. The first project is an empirical study and the development of instruments for adequately addressing sustainability issues, such as climate change, in education practices. The research questions are: what characterizes education on climate change in Flemish universities and university colleges? What are adequate teaching and learning practices on the issue of climate change? What are vital conditions for adequately addressing climate change in higher education? The results of this study are due in April 2021. The University of Ghent is leading this study, so that might be interesting input for this project later on next year. The Living Labs was also a project call for higher education institutions to participatively design and implement concrete mitigation measures on the campus. For compulsory education, it concerns 3 projects: an opportunity for schools to apply for grants for infrastructural measures, a collaboration with Moss Eco-Schools to coach schools in climate trajectories. Moss will give further information on this later on in session 3. There also appears to be a lack of good factual knowledge among teachers and pupils about climate issues. For this purpose, a 10-pager was written out by climate experts with the basis. In addition to a 10-pager, there also appeared to be a need for a guide for teachers and environmental education practitioners to embed climate education in the curriculum, namely which contents and didactics are suitable for which age groups, also taking into account the attitude of children and young people towards this topic. We'll gladly share this with you in April 2022. The second part of the presentation deals with how we work with teacher education. We will talk about the approach, the conclusions, and the topic of global warming in this program. In 2018, we decided to put our program for teacher training back on track. In the past, the Professional Learning Network had contributed to the embedding of ESD in teacher education with, among other things, a number of concrete publications on competencies and ESD for the management level, and many inspiring workshops, seminars, conferences. Moss and our educational centers both have workshops for lecturers and students that are much appreciated. And there are also numerous organizations and local governments working on ESD in and with the teacher training institutes. Many of these actions were started in the 90s, and the Learning Network started in 2008. However, we heard there was still quite some barriers to get ESD embedded. So we decided to find out what are the current needs of teacher trainers on ESD, and how is ESD already embedded, and how did all these existing initiatives contribute or not. We wanted to evaluate and rethink our program and helping other organizations in doing so with theirs, in order to be better informed and to be able to end up with a program based on the needs and the reality of ESD in teacher education now. What were the different steps we took? After inventory of our own program and the programs of our partners to teacher training, we organized 17 focal groups with 69 participants from teacher trainings in university colleges. The questionnaire for these focal groups consisted of questions on our own programs as well as questions of other organizations working towards teacher training. Based on these focal groups, a report was written. The report was discussed with the Ministry of Education and a number of teacher trainers. On the basis of this report and dialogues, an action plan was drawn up, which was discussed again with the Ministry of Education. There is a regular contact with them in order to coordinate projects and communication where possible. With these report and action plans, we also looked for concrete partnerships with organizations that also worked with teacher education. The moments of dialogue about this report will also help them to adjust their programs. We also explicitly consider sharing this information as a role of our environmental education program. We are currently in the phase of concretizing the implementation of the action plan and communication. A call for participation will be sent out at the end of November, and we will present the report and action plan to directors of teacher training programs. The project itself will start in January 2021. Which subjects were discussed during the focal groups and can be found in the report? What is the attitude of students towards sustainability and ESD? How is education for sustainable development currently embedded in teacher education? What expertise does teacher education have on this topic? How does the cooperation with external partners, both Flemish government and other organizations, work? What is the impact and appreciation of this? What suggestions do the teacher education programs have for concrete support? What would enhance ESD in the teacher education? All this led to general conclusions and the action plan. Some general conclusions. The concept of education for sustainable development is known. There is sufficient expertise on the concept of ESD within every teacher training institute, which is very positive. However, there are other needs more related to the concrete implementation. How do you work on ESD with students? But there are less needs for more information on what is ESD, the concept of ESD. The respondents experience a lack of support or mandate to work on ESD. In many university colleges, sustainability is not embedded in the vision of what kind of teacher they want to train. This results in a lack of priority given to the topic, which leads to a lack of time for the lecturer to invest in this topic in his or her working time, but as well in the curriculum itself. Lack of priority results in less interested colleagues, so no time investment in trying to link the different related educations as citizenship or diversity education, which is unfortunate, since many competencies needed are similar for these transversal topics, like systems thinking, working on values, handling emotions, etc. There is an overload on topics in the curriculum of teacher training. How to handle this when you know that sustainability topics need in-depth study? And how can you sequence the learning on ESD throughout the curriculum of the study program, linking related topics and educations, as mentioned above? Students are not easy to get involved, so there's a need to make it very tangible and linked to the future profession of the teacher. These are controversial topics as well. Some students are reluctant to address them in their classes, since they consider it very political to work on these topics. And then there's a general remark that the current student has very superficial and fragmented knowledge on topics like climate change. As I said, there's a lot of expertise in every university college, but the general time constraints make it difficult to maximize the use of this knowledge within their own institution. So, for the specific topic of climate change, what were the conclusions there? Students lack correct factual knowledge, and little is known about effects of climate change nearby, which would make it all more tangible They look at it as something far away, the tropics or the ice caps, while there are very destructive effects in Europe as well. There's a lot of controversy on this topic since the climate marches. It is a very politicized issue with strong positions and theories circulating on social media. Engagement. The student and lecturers don't always see the link with their job as a teacher unless as a subject matter in, for instance, geography, while these are very relevant and huge societal challenges. As I already mentioned, topics like climate change need in-depth study due to their complexity, and there's a lack of time in a sometimes very fragmented curriculum for wicked problems. A lack of time for experiencing or practicing these topics makes that students are often very instrumental and prescriptive in their approach towards sustainability topics. Climate change is more than tips and tricks. A more emancipatory approach could be enriching, but it is more challenging to design as a teacher. So there's a need to experience and practice this approach as well as a student already, but this needs time. How to work on one big idea or societal challenge in depth like climate change and link it to other big ideas like diversity education. How do we explicit ESD competencies in the curriculum of teacher training towards students, working on one education and linking it to other educations? So, how will our program for teacher training look like for the next 4 to 5 years? This action plan is for our entire ESD program and in partnership with some other organizations and the Ministry of Education, of course. There are 5 big result areas. The first is about coaching for embedding ESD in the curriculum of teacher trainings. There will be a call and university colleges will be able to apply. My colleagues of EcoCampus will then coach the institution through a design sprint to embed ESD in the curriculum or in the organization. In most cases, this will be tailor-made since every university college has its own context and functioning. The second, a learning network on different topics with teacher trainers, ESD practitioners, teachers on a shared barrier. The first topic will be on how to deal with controversy on climate change in a learning environment in secondary and higher education, more specifically teacher training. This idea would be to participate with a concrete project you want to implement, improve, and that's the outcome. We will have external speakers learn from other educations like peace education programs, which have more experience in handling controversy and learn from each other. For teacher training lecturers, we will develop an online professionalization module for lecturers who want to get acquainted with ESD, so who recently start but are interested. We will organize every 2 years a conference with international guest speakers on the latest research. Our educational centers will offer workshops for lecturers on very concrete ESD didactics. And we have partnerships to embed relevant topics in conferences of other programs towards formal education. For students, we will develop workshops on very concrete ESD didactics based on the detected needs and offer them in centers, but as well the lecturers will be able to use them themselves. They will be freely available. And most eco-schools will offer workshops on how to work on ESD through a whole school approach. And last, we will improve access to materials, to educational resources through a portal site on ESD and Klassement. Klassement is an open source for educational resources for teachers. And we will develop a guide with criteria to evaluate and design ESD resources and activities.